He's been called the most dangerous man on television. And after 8 years at Fox News Channel, writer and satirist is getting his own weekly comedy, Lord help us all. It's called The Greg Gutfeld Show.
Greg Gutfeld was never supposed to win. Before Fox News, he wasn't a rising star or a misunderstood genius. He was a man who kept getting fired, embarrassed, and pushed out. He mocked women, climate activists, or political figures in ways many found dismissive, crossed lines no one wanted crossed. Editors called him reckless. Executives called him a liability. Then Fox News gave him a time slot designed to bury him. A show no one would watch. A graveyard hour meant for failure. So, what really happened to Greg Gutfeld? Was he rejected for being too dangerous? Or did he survive because he was? Join us as we dive into the story of America's most controversial TV host. The man the industry wanted gone. Greg Gutfeld was not someone the media industry ignored. He was someone they actively rejected. By the time he reached his 30s, his name had become associated with risk, controversy, and career risk. Television executives whispered warnings about him in meetings. Magazine publishers refused to return his calls. This was not a slow fade into irrelevance. This was organized rejection. The pattern started early and never really stopped. Every time Gutfeld gained momentum, something exploded. A joke went too far, an editor complained. Advertisers threatened to pull funding. The cycle repeated itself across different cities, different publications, different formats. Each incident added another layer to his reputation as someone who could not be controlled. Industry insiders did not see him as edgy or bold. They saw him as reckless, the kind of person who would burn down a brand for a laugh, the kind of editor who prioritized his own amusement over corporate stability. When his name appeared on a resume, hiring managers saw a liability. When he pitched ideas, executives saw future lawsuits. By the time he was forced out of his last major magazine position, the verdict was clear. Greg Gutfeld was unemployable. Not unemployable in the struggling sense, but unemployable in the permanent sense. The doors had closed. But here is what made him different from every other canceled media personality. He refused to accept that conclusion. He did not apologize or rebrand himself. Instead, he kept showing up, kept making the same kind of jokes, kept pushing the same boundaries that got him fired in the first place. This refusal created a strange problem for the industry. How do you make someone disappear when they will not leave? How do you end a career that refuses to end? The media world had seen controversial figures before, but most of them eventually broke. They got quieter, more careful, more acceptable. Gutfeld did the opposite. Every failure seemed to make him louder. The question that hung over his entire trajectory was simple but unsettling. Why does someone keep getting fired and refuse to disappear? The answer starts with the moment his career peaked, right before everything came crashing down. Back when he was rising fast, and nobody saw the explosion coming. Success that triggered fear. Before Greg Gutfeld became a warning story, he was a rising star, the kind of editor that publishers noticed, the kind of hire that looked brilliant on paper. In his 20s, he climbed through the magazine industry faster than most people expected. And by 30, he was running major publications with circulations in the hundreds of thousands. His first big break came at Men's Health magazine, where he was not just another assistant editor pushing through copy. He had ideas that actually moved numbers, readership grew, newsstand sales increased, and the magazine started getting noticed in ways it had not before. Gutfeld understood something fundamental about male readers that other editors missed. He knew they were bored with the safe, predictable content that dominated the market. Then came the promotion to editor-in-chief at Stuff magazine, which was not a small operation. Stuff was a men's lifestyle magazine with serious distribution and real advertising dollars behind it. Gutfeld took over and immediately started experimenting. The humor got sharper, the content got riskier, and the magazine started feeling different from everything else on the rack. Circulation exploded, and within months, Stuff was selling hundreds of thousands of copies per issue. Advertisers paid attention, competitors started copying the format, and industry publications wrote features about the transformation. At 32 years old, Greg Gutfeld was being discussed as one of the smartest young editors in publishing. But something else was happening beneath the success, as the humor that drove those sales numbers was making executives uncomfortable. Gutfeld was not just pushing boundaries, he was mocking the idea of boundaries, and his editorial voice did not sound like it cared what corporate thought. The magazine felt unpredictable, dangerous in a way that made legal departments nervous. Meetings with upper management became tense. Advertisers started asking questions about specific content, and other editors at the parent company began complaining that Gutfeld was creating problems they would eventually inherit. The numbers were undeniable, but so was the growing sense that this could not last. People in publishing started asking a quiet question. Was Greg Gutfeld a problem editor who happened to get results? Or was he a threat to the stability of the entire operation? Success usually buys protection in media, but Gutfeld's success seemed to be making him more vulnerable, not less. The tension kept building, the sales kept climbing, and then came the moment that ended everything. One industry conference, one stunt that crossed a line nobody knew existed, one decision that turned a rising star into a cautionary tale overnight. One stunt that destroyed everything. The details of what happened at that industry conference depend on who tells the story. But the consequences were universal. Greg Gutfeld attended a magazine publishers event in the early 2000s, the kind of networking gathering where editors schmooze with advertisers and everyone pretends to care about the future of print media. He was there representing Stuff magazine, riding high on circulation numbers that made other editors jealous. Something went wrong during a panel or presentation. Accounts vary on exactly what Gutfeld said or did, but whatever happened was public, witnessed by dozens of industry executives, and immediately considered beyond acceptable. Some reports suggest it was a joke that mocked sponsors. Others claim it was a stunt that humiliated a senior executive. And a few insiders whispered it involved content so inappropriate that lawyers got involved before the day ended. What matters is not the specific offense, but the speed of the response, because within hours, Gutfeld was fired. Not suspended or reprimanded, but terminated immediately, escorted out before he could return to the office. The parent company issued statements distancing themselves from his actions. Advertisers were personally contacted and reassured, and other staff members were instructed not to speak publicly about what happened. The firing was not handled quietly. It became a story within the industry. A warning passed around editorial meetings and publisher conferences. This is what happens when you go too far. This is what happens when you forget who signs the checks. This is what happens when you prioritize your own entertainment over corporate stability. Greg Gutfeld became the example, the cautionary tale editors referenced when teaching younger staff about professional boundaries. Years of success evaporated in a single afternoon. The magazine he built was reassigned to a safer editor. The contacts he developed stopped returning emails, and the reputation he earned was replaced with something much simpler and more damaging. He was now the guy who got fired at the conference, the editor who destroyed his own career for a laugh, the talent who proved he could not be trusted. Publishing is a small world, and news travels faster than resumes, so every editor in New York knew what happened before Gutfeld could schedule his first job interview. Nobody wanted to take the risk. Nobody wanted to be the publisher who gave him a second chance, only to watch him implode again. The doors that had opened so easily during his 20s were now locked. One joke, one moment, one decision that seemed funny at the time, and suddenly, years of work meant nothing. The question that haunted him was obvious. Can one stunt really erase everything you built, or was the industry just waiting for an excuse? Either way, he needed to leave the country. Blacklisted and exiled. No American outlet would hire him, not the small publications looking for cheap talent, not the startups willing to take risks on controversial names, and definitely not the major magazines that had once competed for his attention. The blacklist was not official. There was no memo or industry announcement, but the result was identical. Greg Gutfeld had become toxic in American media, and everyone knew it. The reality set in quickly, as resumes went unanswered. Phone calls were not returned, and the few meetings he managed to schedule ended with polite rejections and vague excuses. Editors who had praised his work months earlier now claimed budget constraints or staffing freezes. Publishers who had tried to recruit him away from stuff suddenly had no openings. The message was clear even when nobody said it directly. His career in the United States was finished. Desperate and running out of options, Gutfeld made a decision that felt like admitting defeat. He took a job in the United Kingdom. Maxim UK needed an editor. They were far enough from the American publishing scene that his reputation had not fully crossed the Atlantic, and they were willing to overlook what happened at the conference, if it meant getting an editor with his track record. It was not the position he wanted. It was not even close to what he had been doing at Stuff, but it was employment. Moving to London felt like exile, like being sent away from the industry that mattered to a market that did not. British publishing operated differently. The humor was different, the audience expectations were different, and the cultural references that worked in New York fell flat in England. Gutfeld was trying to rebuild in a place that did not care about his previous success and did not understand why he had been fired. The isolation was not just professional, it was geographic and personal, as he was thousands of miles from the contacts he had spent years developing, working in a market where nobody knew his name or cared about his magazine accomplishments. The career that had once seemed unstoppable was now unraveling in silence, far from the American media centers that had rejected him. Failure had followed him across the ocean, and the question that kept surfacing was whether this was temporary or permanent. Was this exile a chance to reset, or was this where careers went to die quietly? The answer would come from an unexpected place, but not before things got much worse. Love during freefall. Greg Gutfeld met Elena Musa in London during the worst period of his professional life, when his career was collapsing and his future in media looked non-existent. She was working as a photo editor and model, Russian by birth, but living in London, navigating the same creative industry that had just rejected him. The timing was almost absurd, finding someone while everything else was falling apart, building something personal while his professional identity disintegrated. Their relationship developed quickly, not in the dramatic romantic sense, but in the practical reality of two people who connected during chaos. Elena was not impressed by magazine credentials or circulation numbers. She met Gutfeld after the firing, after the exile, after the industry had already written him off. She saw him at his lowest point and decided he was worth her time anyway, which created a foundation that had nothing to do with career success or public reputation. They got married in 2004, just a few years after he arrived in London, while he was still trying to figure out what came next professionally. The marriage happened during maximum uncertainty, when Gutfeld had no clear path forward and no guarantee that his career would ever recover. Most people wait until their lives stabilize before making that kind of commitment, but stability was not an option, so they moved forward anyway. What made the relationship significant was not romance, but timing, because Elena provided private stability while his public reputation continued to collapse. She was not part of the media world that had rejected him, she did not care about industry gossip or publishing drama, and she was not invested in the version of Greg Gutfeld that American magazines had built up and torn down. She knew the person, not the persona, which meant she was not disappointed when the industry turned on him. The contrast was stark. His professional life was defined by rejection and failure, while his personal life was defined by someone choosing him repeatedly. London became less about exile and more about rebuilding. Not his career necessarily, but his sense that forward movement was still possible. Elena represented proof that not everything had to fall apart at once, that some things could actually work, even when most things did not. But private happiness does not pay bills or restore professional reputation, and eventually the London experiment ran its course. The UK publishing job did not lead anywhere. The distance from American media became a liability instead of a refuge, and the reality set in that rebuilding overseas was not actually rebuilding, it was just hiding. Gutfeld needed to go back, needed to face the industry that blacklisted him, needed to find a way back into American media, even though nobody wanted him there. So he returned to New York with a wife, no job prospects, and a reputation that had only gotten worse during his absence. Rock bottom in New York. Returning to New York in the mid-2000s meant confronting the same industry that had exiled him, except now he had been gone long enough that people barely remembered why he mattered in the first place. The magazine contacts had moved on. The publishing executives who knew his work had shifted to other companies, and the younger editors coming up had never heard of Stuff magazine or cared about circulation numbers from 5 years earlier. Gutfeld was not just blacklisted anymore, he was irrelevant. His contract at Maxim UK ended without renewal, which was the polite corporate way of saying they were done with him. He came back to the States with a wife to support, no savings cushion, and no clear idea of what he could do for work. The magazine industry had evolved without him. Digital media was starting to dominate conversations, and the editorial approach that made him successful in print felt outdated in a world obsessed with web traffic and viral content. He needed work immediately, not the dream job or the prestigious position, but anything that paid. And that desperation led him to the Huffington Post. This was not a natural fit. The Huffington Post was a liberal news and opinion site that represented almost everything Gutfeld had spent his career mocking. But they were hiring, and he needed income. He took a position as a blogger, which was a massive step down from editor-in-chief of a national magazine, writing short posts for an audience that mostly disagreed with everything he believed. The irony was impossible to ignore. The guy who built his career on edgy conservative humor was now writing for one of the most progressive platforms on the internet. But Gutfeld did not try to fit in or soften his approach. Instead, he used the platform exactly how you would expect, turning his blog into a weapon, mocking the same progressive culture that the Huffington Post celebrated, using their own site to ridicule their own audience. It was a bizarre arrangement that could not last, but it kept him employed while he figured out what came next. He was broke, directionless, working for a site that ideologically opposed everything he represented, and watching younger media personalities build careers in spaces he no longer understood. This was rock bottom, not the dramatic kind with substance abuse or public meltdowns, but the quiet kind where you realize the industry moved on without you. The question that defined this period was simple. How dangerous is someone with nothing left to lose? Someone willing to mock the hand that feeds him? Someone who has already been exiled once and survived? That dangerous edge was exactly what caught the attention of someone at Fox News, looking for chaos they could control. The Fox News Experiment. Fox News offered Greg Gutfeld a show in 2007, but calling it an opportunity would be generous. The network had a problem. They were getting complaints about not enough diverse programming, not enough comedy, not enough counterweight to the serious political coverage that dominated their schedule. Gutfeld was the cheap solution, a guy desperate enough to take almost anything, controversial enough to check certain boxes, and expendable enough that nobody would care if it failed. The show was called Red Eye, and the time slot told you everything you needed to know about Fox's expectations. 3 in the morning Eastern Time, which meant almost nobody would watch. Advertisers would not pay premium rates, and the show could exist without affecting the network's reputation. This was not a primetime gamble or a strategic investment. This was Fox burying a diversity complaint in the dead of night, where failure would go unnoticed. Gutfeld understood exactly what was happening. He was being given a show designed to fail quietly. A program that existed so executives could claim they tried something different without actually risking anything important. The budget was minimal, the staff was small, and the production values were deliberately cheap. Nobody at Fox expected Red Eye to succeed. They expected it to exist for a year or two, and then disappear without consequences. But the time slot that was supposed to bury the show actually freed it. Because when nobody is watching and nobody cares, there are no rules. Primetime shows had standards departments reviewing scripts, advertisers demanding approval over content, and executives monitoring every segment for potential controversy. Red Eye had none of that. The 3 a.m. slot meant Gutfeld could do whatever he wanted because nobody important was paying attention. The freedom was complete and probably accidental. Fox was not trying to create an experimental comedy show. They were trying to make a problem go away cheaply. But the result was the same. Gutfeld suddenly had a television platform with almost zero corporate oversight. A show that could fail without damaging his reputation further because his reputation was already destroyed. And an audience that did not exist yet, which meant he could not disappoint anyone. This was the setup that should have ended in quiet cancellation. A forgotten show that briefly existed in a time slot where television goes to die. The budget stayed low, the expectations stayed non-existent, and the network continued ignoring what was happening at 3 in the morning. But something unexpected started growing in that neglected time slot, something that thrived specifically because nobody was watching, something that would eventually force Fox News to pay attention in whether they wanted to or not. Red Eye and the Cult in the Dark. Red Eye did not look like a real show. The set was cheap, the graphics were basic, and the whole production had the energy of a college access television program that somehow ended up on a major network. Gutfeld hosted from behind a desk with a rotating panel of guests, mostly comedians, writers, and media personalities willing to show up at 2 in the morning to tape a show that aired at 3. There was no script polish, no professional sheen, and no attempt to imitate what successful talk shows looked like. The format was deliberately chaotic. Segments ran long or cut short depending on how the conversation developed. Guests mocked each other and the host. And Gutfeld spent as much time ridiculing Fox News itself as he did discussing actual news. The show treated nothing as sacred. Not politics, not culture, not even the network that was airing it. This was not calculated brand safety. This was genuine disrespect for the idea that television had to be careful. What made Red Eye different from every other late-night show was that it did not want mainstream acceptance. Gutfeld was not trying to book A-list celebrities or compete with Letterman and Leno. He was building something specifically for people who felt alienated by regular late-night television. The humor was weirder, more politically incorrect, and deliberately designed to offend the kind of audience that watched Colbert or Jon Stewart. This was not comedy trying to unite people. This was comedy drawing lines. The audience that found the show was small but obsessive. Insomniacs, third-shift workers, college students, and media industry people who stayed up late enough to stumble across something that felt genuinely different. They were not watching because Red Eye was good, necessarily. They were watching because it was honest in a way that television usually was not. Willing to mock everyone, including itself. Unafraid of being hated by people who would never watch anyway. Fox executives were not paying attention. The ratings at 3 a.m. were too small to register as success or failure, and the show was not generating complaints because almost nobody knew it existed. Red Eye existed in a vacuum, ignored by critics, ignored by the network, and ignored by the broader culture. But that vacuum allowed something strange to develop. A loyal audience that felt like they had discovered something secret, something the mainstream had not ruined yet. The show kept growing slowly, adding viewers who told other viewers, building a cult following in a time slot where cults were the only kind of following possible. Gutfeld was not winning, but he was surviving, which was more than anyone expected. Eventually, the network would notice those slowly climbing numbers, and that attention would change everything about what Red Eye was allowed to be. The late-night takeover. Red Eye built enough of an audience that Fox News could not ignore it anymore, and in 2015, Gutfeld got moved to a new show called The Greg Gutfeld Show, airing at 10 p.m. on Saturdays. This was not prime time exactly, but it was close enough to matter. A real-time slot with real expectations and an actual budget. The network was betting that the chaos from 3 a.m. could translate to an hour where people actually watched television. The format stayed similar. A panel show with rotating guests discussing news and culture. But the production values improved and the audience grew immediately. Within months, the show was pulling in over 1 million viewers per episode, which was significant for a Saturday night cable program. Fox noticed the numbers and decided to take a bigger risk, moving Gutfeld to weeknights at 11 p.m. in 2021 with a show called Gutfeld. This was direct competition with the traditional late-night hosts, Colbert on CBS, Fallon on NBC, and Kimmel on ABC. These were established shows with decades of industry credibility, massive production budgets, and the kind of mainstream acceptance that Gutfeld had never achieved. Nobody expected a Fox News show to compete with network television late night. The audiences were different, the formats were different, and the cultural credibility gap seemed impossible to cross. But Gutfeld started winning almost immediately, not occasionally or in specific demographics, but consistently in total viewership. By 2022, his show was regularly beating Colbert, Fallon, and Kimmel in the ratings, pulling in more viewers than programs that had dominated late night for years. The victory was not subtle or disputed. The numbers were clear, and the trend was undeniable. The mainstream media response was predictable. Critics dismissed the ratings as meaningless because Gutfeld's audience was older and more conservative. Industry publications questioned the measurement methodology, and late-night insiders insisted that real cultural influence could not be measured by viewership alone. The message was clear. Gutfeld could have the numbers, but he would never have the respect. This created a strange dynamic where Gutfeld was simultaneously the most watched late-night host in America and the least accepted by the industry that made late-night matter. He had won the ratings war but lost the cultural war. Or maybe he had never been fighting for cultural acceptance in the first place. Either way, the man who was unemployable 20 years earlier was now dominating the exact format that had rejected him, and nobody knew what to do with that reality. The man who outlasted the system. Greg Gutfeld is still hosting his show, still pulling ratings that beat the competition, still generating the same mix of devoted fans and disgusted critics that defined his entire career. The backlash never stopped. Media critics still dismiss him. Late-night insiders still refuse to acknowledge his success as legitimate. And the industry that blacklisted him decades ago still treats him like an outsider who got lucky. But the numbers do not lie, and the longevity does not lie either. Gutfeld has been on Fox News in some capacity for nearly 20 years, survived multiple corporate regime changes, outlasted countless critics who predicted his imminent failure, and built an audience that keeps showing up, regardless of what mainstream media thinks. The cult that formed at 3 a.m. became a movement that dominates 11 p.m., and nobody has figured out how to stop it. In 2024, at 60 years old, Gutfeld became a father, which added another unexpected chapter to a career defined by unexpected turns. The man who spent his 30s getting fired and his 40s rebuilding from exile was now raising a child while hosting the most watched late-night show in America. The timeline feels almost absurd, like someone wrote a career arc specifically to confuse people about what success actually means. The final irony is that Gutfeld won without ever getting what winners usually get. He has the ratings, but not the respect. The audience, but not the acceptance. The longevity, but not the industry credibility. He beat Colbert and Fallon in viewership, but will never be invited to host the Emmys or be profiled sympathetically in major publications. He succeeded by every measurable metric, while remaining permanently outside the culture that measures success. The system that tried to destroy his career in his 30s never accepted him back, but it also never managed to make him disappear. He survived by refusing to play by rules that were designed to eliminate people like him, by building audiences in places where audiences were not supposed to exist, and by turning rejection into a brand that resonated with millions of people who felt equally rejected. Whether Greg Gutfeld beat the system, or whether the system accidentally needed someone like him to beat, is still unclear. But what is certain is that he outlasted everyone who said he would not. And he did it without ever apologizing for being exactly who he was. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.